Trump summit does near, Ukrainians fear the possibility of land swaps, as any peace deal would involve agreements on territory. Russia currently occupies nearly a fifth of Ukraine's land. Our chief international security correspondent, Nick Payton-Walsh, looks at the key areas that President Putin has his eyes on.
Any peace deal in Ukraine is going to ultimately be about land. And when President Trump talks about swapping territories, this is Russian-occupied areas, but it's these three parts here, black surrounded, that have always been part of Russian President Vladimir Putin's most maximalist war goals. It's what he wants. The lines we've drawn as best as we can here, but the stakes are incredibly high. Any minor inaccuracy of my pen could be a place that thousands of people have fought and died for, or still live. Now, in just recent days, there's been a tiny advance here by the Russians, but it's significant and caused some concern and even denials and reinforcements sent from Kiev. But this Donetsk area is potentially, if we understand what the Kremlin's proposed, somewhere they want Ukrainians to withdraw from entirely in exchange for a ceasefire. And look at it, it's a huge area. What could they give back? These tiny border parts occupied by Russia, a buffer zone, President Putin calls it, but it's hardly a fair exchange. And so the real hard-to-solve question, what happens to Zaporizhia here and Kherson? Now, Russia occupies probably about 2/3 of each, but Putin wants all of it. They were kicked out, the Russians, here in the first year of the war. But it's impossible to imagine Ukraine deciding to pull out of massive areas like this, and equally impossible to imagine that Russians will give up a big strategic gain of a land corridor that they managed to take when the big invasion began down to Crimea that they've held since 2014. That's the sticking point, and there's very little obvious way through it.
Well, while Mr. Trump says he's looking for a peace deal, the Russian president is expected to bring a number of other issues to the table. Mr. Putin is praising the Trump administration, calling its efforts to stop the conflict in Ukraine energetic and sincere. The Kremlin hinting that it could also try to strike a nuclear arms deal with Washington. Let's bring in Fred Pleitgen, who is keeping a close eye on all of this. We were talking yesterday, Fred, about how we didn't actually know much about the Kremlin way into this meeting, but now we find out it's extremely broad. What's the strategy, do you think?
Yeah, it's extremely broad, and I think the Russians have shown today that this meeting is extremely important to them. We obviously had Vladimir Putin coming out earlier today in a meeting with really some of his top officials in the government and telling them some of the goals that he has for the summit, calling President Trump's initiative energetic and sincere, and then also hinting that possibly there could be broader agreements in other areas as well. And just the makeup also of the Russian delegation, which was also made public earlier today by a senior Kremlin aide, that also indicates for the Russians how seriously they take this, and then also how broad their agenda is as well. If you have, for instance, not just senior Kremlin aides and the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, there, but also the defense minister, who's extremely important, of course, right now as the conflict in Ukraine drags on, but the finance minister too. And of course, the Russians have been hinting at possible business deals and, of course, for their desire to have sanctions relief also. I was actually, Max, earlier today able to speak to one of the delegation members for the Russians, who is currently actually traveling to Alaska to be part of that summit. And here's what he had to say about how things are unfolding.
President Trump has threatened severe consequences if there's no movement towards a ceasefire. What's Russia hoping to get out of this meeting?
Well, I think dialogue is very important, and I think it's a very positive meeting for the world, because during Biden administration, no dialogue was happening. So I think it's very important to hear Russian position directly. And there's lots of misunderstandings, misinformation about the Russian position. And it's also a chance to sort of reset, if the meeting goes well, U.S.-Russia relations.
That was Kirill Dmitriev speaking to me earlier today, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, and really someone who's been the point person here on the ground in Moscow for all of those meetings between the envoy Steve Witkoff of the Trump administration and Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Of course, the last one happening just last week, which has now led to the summit in Alaska. But the point there being clear, him speaking about a possible reset of U.S.-Russia relations, and I think that In an ideal scenario for the Russians is what they would be looking for Ukraine to be one of the topics on the table, certainly the most important one, but then also to speak about other things like, for instance, sanctions relief, like, for instance, business deals in the future, like, for instance, doing things together in the Arctic, where, of course, both countries have some pretty big interests. The U.S. with raw commodities in places like Alaska, and, of course, the Russians as well with things like rare earths, oil and gas also in the Arctic region as well, Max.
OK, Fred, thank you. You'll be watching tomorrow like the rest of us. What we don't know is, will Donald Trump ask Ukraine to give up land? Joining me now, Neil Melvin, Director of International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you for joining us. I'm probably not going to get the answer to that tomorrow, are we? But we might get a hint at how Donald Trump sees a deal playing out in future.
Yeah, I mean, there's been enormous speculation ahead of this summit, and we just heard, I think, from one of your reporters, there are many different ways that this summit could go. I think most likely we'd like to see sort of a broad agreement on some framework for further talks. And then, as Trump himself has said, the follow-up meeting that they're already talking about, possibly in Europe, but with Zelensky and maybe some European leaders present, that may be actually where they get into the details, which are going to be much more important.
When we say Ukraine giving up land, what are we talking about there? Because I think the Ukrainian view is they might not control all of the land after all of this, but they'll still own it, technically. It'll be occupied. What's your understanding?
Well, there was quite a bit of confusion, I think, after President Trump's representative Witkoff met with Putin about what precisely was being proposed. Initially, it seemed that there was some idea that Ukraine might be actually forced to give up the land that it currently controls because Russia wants to claim the whole of the Donbass region, and Ukraine flatly rejected that idea. There seems to be a pullback from now, in part because the European leaders have weighed in and said that we can't have this land swap idea. And now the focus seems to be on starting with the line of contact where the two armies are facing each other and working back from there, in which some kind of de facto recognition of Russian control of these occupied territories it has now, including the possibility maybe even to conduct economic activities there. There's reports of a possible deal on rare earths and minerals being worked in that area. So not de jure recognition of Russian ownership, but de facto recognition of Russian control.
But will Russia be happy with that? Surely they'd want that to become part of the Russian state.
Well, I think that this is why this is just a first step, because Russia's ultimate aim is clearly to win in Ukraine. Putin still believes that he can achieve his goals militarily, and those goals are very expansive. He wants to actually end the existence of the Ukrainian state as in its current form, and the idea there's a Ukrainian nation. He doesn't want to give up on that. So I think he'll be certainly wanting to drag out these negotiations, these discussions, to give the impression for Trump that there is a process underway, but actually to also allow Russia to continue to prosecute the war, but to see itself as an equal on the world stage with the United States. That in this summit recognizes in a way that Putin is someone of the stature that Trump can meet and discuss not just Ukraine, but wider global issues.
What do you make of this sort of broadening of the agenda that appears to have come from the Russian side? Discussion about a possible nuclear deal, for example. I mean, you know, it does complicate the meeting in many ways, doesn't it? It makes it much broader and less able to really delve into specific issues around the war, for example.
That's been a long-term Russian goal, is to see that they can position themselves as a great power, sort of alongside the United States and China, and be recognized as a key player in creating a new world order and having these kind of meetings. And so right from the beginning, the Russians have been keen to talk about the Middle East, about nuclear issues, about the possibility of doing economic deals. I think in the Arctic is one idea. And so they will be trying to do that. And Putin will no doubt go into this meeting with this as a key speaking point to actually broaden the agenda, to put Ukraine into this bigger context, because that also gives them more leverage to play across those different issues and to take the focus away from Ukraine.
Neil Melvin, we'll be watching. Thank you.